And welcome to the React Show. We've got a really fun show for you all today. It's a little less heavy compared to last week, but I think it'll be a lot of fun. I'm Thomas, and I'm with my co-host Austin. We're with Owl Creek, high performance React consultancy. Welcome, Austin.
Hey, glad to be here. Thank you.
And as we mentioned last week, we now have a way to send us questions and feedback. That would be send us an email at thereactshow@owlcreek.studio. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you if you have any feedback, if you want us to answer any questions on the show. Just let us know. And so we'll get started. So the topic today is driving React forward, and this. We'll go into a little backstory. It comes from a project I did about 5 years ago called the 3L project, which was a sort of more broad project that had a similar goal, but in terms of computing itself. So we looked at like, hey, if you kind of like don't look at the current trajectory of languages or operating systems or whatever systems we have now, where could we be if we could we make things way better in some way, And so that was really the exploration we did in that project. And I thought, that would be a fun thing to look at in terms of like React and maybe JavaScript and the web ecosystem. Like, hey, we have something that exists, and we know that it's hard to change, something with as much momentum as the web. But like, I still think it's a really good exercise to direct future development if we think about like, where could we be if we like just kind of ignored maybe the current situation somewhat, and imagined the future, Like, could we make our lives as programmers way better? Could we make users' lives way better? Are there major improvements like that? So I thought, we could just sort of have some fun talking about different ideas we had. And if anyone listening has ideas, we'd love to hear from you what your ideas are. I'll just probably start with maybe an easy one. So we'll just kind of jump into it here, which would be a designer for React. And by that, I mean like, a GUI program where you could design how things look and actually connect with your code. Yeah, like a good one. So these do exist to some extent with different component libraries, but they're all, in my experience, kind of primitive and basically like build a basic UI and then export it, and then you're kind of done using the GUI. But I find a good designer, like I've used with Qt, or even actually, I wouldn't say it's a good designer, but like Visual Basic, it worked well because everything was really integrated. So like, you drag a button onto the screen, double click the button, it takes you right to like the on click handler for that button. Like it's a really nice experience. And I think we could have something like that, but way better for React. So it could read your React project and find all your components and probably organize them based on like your components and then components imported from like a component library like MUI or whatever. And so you could be like, okay, yeah, drag this one on, and sort of like storybook in the sense that you could see all your components, but this would be in a designer itself. So you don't have to like kind of look through the code and be like, oh, what is this? Is this the button I want? Or do I need to make my own button? Or what can I change about this button? Or, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of, I think, improvements we could make. And I think it would be awesome if we just had a generic React designer that worked with any component library, any project. And you didn't have to eject your code. It was integrated with your IDE. So you could interact with everything directly, jump into the code, jump into the design, and back and forth. That's my idea. What do you think, Austin?
So, you just mentioned that it would be perhaps an IDE, integrated development environment. You would have like a code editor and designer, or would it perhaps live inside of the browser as like a browser plugin? What are your thoughts on like how the developer would use this?
Yeah, I think it absolutely needs to be connected to your editor. How that's done, whether it's in the browser or something else, I don't know that I'm really thinking that much about that level of implementation detail. I'm just kind of thinking like in my magical wishful world, you know, having that connection would be important between the code and the designer itself. So maybe even calling it a designer isn't even the right term because it's like designer and editor. Like I don't necessarily think they need to be connected. They could be use some protocol to talk to each other or whatever, but like having it just all be connected and seamless, I think would make a really great experience, both as an experience, like a experienced developer. I just used experience twice in a row. But anyways, as an experienced developer and as someone new, especially as someone new, like I remember that about Visual Basic. It was just so awesome because you didn't really need to learn a lot before you could start using it. With React right now, you actually kind of have to go through and learn a ton of it before you can like get it. Like if you haven't used something like it before, you really have to learn a lot before it all starts clicking and you can start making a real program. If you had a good designer editor integration, it should just be able to like run your project and like have a play button. You say new project, it shows you a screen, drag some buttons onto it, double click it, make it show an alert or something, and just take like 5 minutes. Like I think that would be amazing. But then also have it work for really complex projects so you can continue to use it.
Yeah, I think the main thing that comes up in my mind is it seems that there would have to be some sort of standardization of how um, design is implemented in React, or like how components interact with each other. And it like made me think of the atomic design principle, where you have like atoms, molecules, and organisms, and like how when you would drag and drop these items into each other, like how that would work. Because like if
Mm-hmm.
you had this like alert that you just drag into the page, like how do you make certain that it's like living where you want it to live in the grand scheme of everything. um, that just seems to be the biggest hurdle, would be like how do you nest components properly and manage that entire orchestration. I'm just like seeing that the web of prop drilling or whatever, and it's quite interesting to imagine.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't yeah, I don't know if I have answers to that, and it might even mean like in my head when I'm thinking about this, I'm like I don't care if that means re-architecting how React works or something. Like I'm thinking like, yeah, let's make something like this happen. But you bring up a really good point in terms of like implementation. As it stands now, that's probably why it doesn't exist. That's hard, very hard. And I think even with what we have now, you could probably make it exist. I don't know. I don't know how much of a priority it is. I think maybe it's just like there's not money in it, not enough money in it, I guess, for the amount of development effort or whatever. But I think it could happen. It would just be a ton of work.
Yeah, and I'm sure that developers that are trying to protect their jobs from having React be too easy are also like, let's not make this feature so that I can't be outsourced as easily.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't even thought of that. I mean, yeah, that could happen. I would never do that, of course. But
Of course.
did you have anything else you wanted to say about that, or?
No, it's an interesting idea. Definitely would be nice. I know that like for example, Figma, like a lot of the time we work with designers that use Figma. I think there are integrations with Figma that you can export Figma to React code or React Native code. Stuff like that would be cool to look into, like see how they're doing it now and maybe learn from these projects. I don't know any of them specifically,
Yeah.
but I do think it ultimately in the long run would be really beneficial for creating applications faster with like in a more standardized way to like instead of like you're actually tied into having to use a quote component library versus like um, having a lot of custom components flying around that you're coding. Instead, if you had this visual designer, you would have to create the components first as a standard reusable component to then use in the design. It would
Hmm.
it would make design be taken more seriously and it would perhaps lead to better UI and UX in general.
I hadn't actually thought of that, but I think you're absolutely right. That would be a tremendous benefit. Yeah, I've always been excited about this idea, but now I'm even more excited.
Right? Like these UI, like I know in a project we're working on now, they're like the design has always kind of been iterating, and now it's kind of getting to a point where it's more finalized and a sort of design library has been created, and we're now like implementing that as like with each new feature or feature updates, but there's still design elements throughout the app that are like not caught up, or we've been like using different types all over the place, and it seems like using a designer like this that you're talking about would kind of force proper design, and it would ensure that as the design does update, we're actually using it's it's not just updating on the design side, but it's updating in the application as they're both tied directly to each other.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it would help you more easily like see where you differ from the design, or like where one component, if you're looking through the list of components and something didn't get updated or whatever, it'd be a lot more clear. Or if like you're like, oh, we have three different buttons, like, stuff that maybe we don't even know because they're like one's named the fat button and one's the skinny button. And, nobody realized there was also a generic button except the person that wrote the first, like, so you end up with that without even really realizing it. This could really help show that, be like, hey, here are all the buttons.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. I like that. If only I had the time to implement it, but yeah.
Yeah, it sounds pretty nice because like Storybook, it's cool and all, but it's like it's its own separate thing
Hmm.
that you have to like maintain, and it's not necessarily coupled in directly with what you're programming. So like this sounds like a much more tightly coupled interaction that like enforces these rules, and that sounds great to me.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I also think it ties in nicely with our next topic, which is just exploration in general. So we were talking about essentially exploring the components we had. I also wanted to talk about exploring your React application in a general sense. So like right now, there is like React Dev Tools with like an inspector, which is it's not bad, but it's pretty limiting. I don't find myself using it that often, just because it just doesn't have a lot of what I think would be useful. But yeah, I was just wondering, in my head, like, what could be done to make it so that your running application is easier to like interact and manipulate with? Because like, at least for me, a lot of the way I program is I just get something working, get something on screen or whatever, and then I, have to tweak it to make it, in the right position or behave the way I need it to behave, or so I like coming from a like Lisp background where we have like the integrated REPL and everything, which we do have with JavaScript, but it's not really as integrated with React. Like it's pretty hard to like directly interact with your running React application. So I'm thinking like, wouldn't it be awesome to be able to modify things like props and state and stuff in your running React application and see the effect right away? Like right now, you can kind of do stuff like this by editing your code and getting hot refresh, but it's kind of hodgepodgey and it doesn't work that well in my opinion. I think it'd be awesome if there was like a browser extension or something where you could just go in and sort of make the component the way you want it live, and then just get the code or save the code or whatever, connect the code in some way. That was one of my ideas. I don't know if you have any ideas, Austin, for that.
Yeah, like you said, the like React can't be interfaced with through the REPL through the console. Like the console is mainly used for like logging. It would be pretty cool. Like there's a disconnect. You have to like you're writing the code and then you go to the
Hmm.
browser to like see the effect and then you're hopping back and forth versus being able to more directly interact with these things. I honestly I don't use the React Dev tools because like I think I mentioned in a previous podcast we were having some bugs in um, we were having bugs in Safari, and so I just was like, I'm just going to kind of be a dedicated Safari developer because some of these people were using Safari for our application. So I don't have access to the dev tools, but so I couldn't really tell you what does exist there off the top of my head. But I do remember when I was using Redux in a project that kind of has some similar
Mm-hmm.
features you're talking about. The Redux dev tools, you could kind of like step through the state and kind of like modify it there or pause it and like go back and forth, which I thought was pretty cool. Even though I'm not a big Redux fan personally.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I actually, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, it would. So the thing is, like, yeah, Redux, you could do that, but you'd have to, and that works because it's fully purely functional. You only ever update your state through purely functional means. Um, and yeah, I mean, the problem with that is you just would have to use it for literally everything. There's not. It's probably more work to make it work, for a non-Redux situation. But yeah, I think when you're talking like the console, or the REPL, I like, so when was used to do just plain HTML, or when I end up doing that now, you can like select an element in the inspector, and then $0 will reference it down in the console, right? So you can like inspect it, modify it. Like I would look for something like that with React components. Like, can I select a component and then in the console start manipulating it like with code? I think that once you cross into that connection between your debugging and your ability to interact with it with code, it opens up a lot of opportunities. Like, when you look at just JavaScript, when I'm talking to somebody about some JavaScript question, usually what I do is I put it into the REPL and find out what happens, right? Like that's probably what most of us do. Oh, what does this function do again? How does this behave again? I write a lot. Maybe it's just me, but I write a lot of my code in the REPL when I can. But React code, I can't. It just doesn't. That's not a thing. And so you're more of
right.
the like write the code out and then pray it works. And if it doesn't, kind of hodgepodge your way through figuring out why it doesn't work. I would love a more integrated solution.
Right. I think the problem is the feature that React is built upon is translating these components to the DOM, right? And so like once it's translated over, you don't have access to the way the components were written. It's all now HTML. So it's like if there were a way to like have an interface of the pre-translation to like directly interface with that, to modify that in the browser
Yeah.
through the inspector or something. That would be pretty cool.
I mean, I think that must be somewhat in existence because the current dev tools allow you to actually click on the components and work your way through them. So that must be. It seems like it's probably possible even now. Yeah. Um, I was
Well,
so
maybe there's someone listening right now that is a React Dev Tools wizard and has some insights on things
yeah.
that we don't. Would love to hear about more of that.
Yeah, it's definitely not an area of my expertise. I'm just thinking, what I would want. Maybe it already exists. um, that'd be even better. Yeah, the next thing I was thinking about that would be really cool is being able to like record and play back renders. Um, I think this is something that we've as React developers we've all had to deal with is sort of manually deconstructing renders. Like maybe it renders 3 times, and the first time your variable is the thing you expect, but by the end it's not, and you're like, hey, how did that happen? Or why is it not what I'm expecting? I think it would be awesome to hit a record button. It records every render and records why the render was triggered. So you could figure out, like, oh, okay, that's why, that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense. Show you all the props and state for every render and the output. Like, I think that would be amazing. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there are some tools that are like libraries that have been created that you can kind of inspect why something has been rendered, but I don't think that they're very robust at the moment. It would be really cool to figure out like what is causing all of these chain reactions. I know that since I've started using hooks, that I've noticed there are a lot of re-renders that occur um, from like using multiple hooks and
Yeah.
multiple of these use effects. Like that, there's a lot that gets fired off, and it's not ever clear like you'll console log inside of the main component page or whatever you're on a value, and it would be cool to know like which console log was related to which like effect firing or which whatever firing without having to like put console logs in all of the different hooks or that you're using.
Yeah. You can use console.trace, which helps a lot. But yeah, you might still end up in the case where the thing that triggers it is higher up the chain, and so you might not see it or whatever. But
I didn't even know I the only consoles that I have used is like console.error, console.log of course, and console.table. So that's cool. I didn't know that trace existed.
oh yeah,
Could you
trace is great because it will show you the whole call stack to that point.
mm,
Yeah, it can be a little bit weird to like look at and react, but as long as you're in development mode, it works pretty well.
cool.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm looking at the Mozilla developer docs now, and that's pretty cool.
Sweet. Yeah.
Thank you for learning something new every day.
Yeah, of course. Um, let's see. I think we already talked about the next thing I had on my list here. So, is there anything else, Austin, that you would like to see in terms of exploration, interactive development type of things?
Well, like there's like the breakpoints and stuff that you can use to
Mm,
kind of like zoom through your code. There's just like it's not a really clean ecosystem to use. I feel like especially in Safari, it's just like to find the parts that I'm trying to do breakpoints on. It's just always messy digging through that. It would be cool to be able to I know that one of our coworkers is a big fan of WebStorm, and I think that there's like breakpoints within that IDE that you can use. It would be cool if there was just some sort of standardized approach on navigating like interactively like that as well.
Yeah, and that actually makes me think of a big problem, which is with the debugging is um, when when you have multiple renders going on or a bunch of renders, it sucks using the JavaScript debugger, whether it's in WebStorm or the browser, because it just always hangs. You're like, no, I don't want to always hang on every, like it needs. I mean, I guess there's ways you could probably hack around it, but by default, I don't necessarily always want to see every single render. I just want to see a render, and then let the application go or something like that. Like, I definitely feel like there could be improvements with that.
Right. Well, maybe someone, I hope our listeners maybe have some tips and tricks and hacks that if they're listening. So please, yeah, do reach out if you have any.
Yeah. And if you have any tips on safety, which is our next topic, we'd love to hear that too. So, what I mean by safety is like, um, how do you make it so that your system is just safer by default in terms of like how your code behaves, how it behaves towards the client system. So like safer by default would be a system that doesn't open up avenues for crashing when it doesn't need to, or errors that don't need to happen, or a big thing is like null or undefined can lead to, I don't know if you'd really call them unsafe, but less safe situations. How are we handling it in one place versus another? So I'm thinking of safety in that sense. Basically, how do we make it so the programmer can write safe code easier? My big one that I would like to see improvements on would be use effect. I feel like a lot of people don't really fully understand how it works. They just like use it all the time and hope for the best. But I feel like it has a lot of foot guns built into it. Both, a hot topic, the dependency array, but also beyond that, like, are you returning a cleanup function when you need to? Are you even like so many times people have like made a minor mistake on the syntax of use effect, like accidentally returning something or that they didn't mean to. Like, it just seems like it's rife with a lot of issues, and I don't know if it's because of the underlying concept is wrong. Like, maybe we're wrong about how we're doing that. I don't know, or maybe it's just a bad API, but I don't know. That's something that has often bugged me about the newer version of React with functional components.
Yeah, I mean, use effect in general. Could we actually do a little deep dive into like proper usage of it? I know that, for example, we have a hook that we made where we do like an event listener for if changes have been made. It's like to use the on before unload to like if like changes have been made on the page you try to hit back. We like have an event listener that's in there, and we return the destruction of that. We turn off the event listener by returning it in the effect.
Yeah.
Are there what other times within use effect should you be returning a cleanup? Is it typical to need to return a cleanup? Because I feel like I've only ever done a cleanup in that instance, and like with React hook form, I saw that like when you register a custom
Hmm.
um, input, you should also unregister it on the unmount of it. Is there any other instances where I should be using the return cleanup?
I mean, it's any time that you have like actual side effects. Yeah, that I think actually your question is indicative of the problem. It's hard to know, and if you don't get it right, it creates problems.
Right.
So when I'm talking about safety here, I would be looking at, okay, how could we redesign this system so that anything like that that needs some kind of cleanup, it's handled automatically in some way, um, or the system doesn't compile without it, or like that. That's really what I mean by being safe. Is the system's
Mm,
got your back, and I don't,
right.
I honestly don't have a good answer for you. And I think that really is why we're talking about this. I think it's just an error prone construct. Uh,
Well, I think that answer in itself is good because yeah, it is unclear, and the situations vary so much, and like our code, it varies so much. So, and it's still pretty new, and we're not really sure how we're kind of figuring it out as we go along, right?
and I'm not like necessarily criticizing, the existence of use effect because clearly it has value. But in my magical dream world, I'm like, yeah, we can definitely do better. I don't know exactly what this better is yet, but like, I gotta imagine there's a better way to do it. And obviously, one of the ways is React has already said that dependency array in the future could be automatically filled in by the compiler. You wouldn't fill it in yourself, but that also brings up another issue with it, which is the fact that people abuse that dependency array to basically do conditional use effects. Um, like, oh, I only want this effect to run when this one variable changes, so I'm going to put that in the dependency array list, which is not at all how it was intended to be used. And a designer of an API like this, it's not necessarily wrong to give people the power to do whatever they want to do, even if it's dangerous, right? I'm not saying that needs to change. I'm just saying like maybe the normal way of using it doesn't include things like that where it's so easy to misuse it.
Well, the bad thing is that is like how I primarily use effect is I either use it with an empty dependency array to run something on the page load one time, or I have like a state object or a state value that I'm watching, and if that gets updated, I want to run something on it, and I usually only put in the thing that I want the effect to run if only that thing changes, right?
Yep.
And I think that like our the application in question right now, the warnings in our application is something like 500 maybe, like with
Right.
how many there are that exist.
Yep.
And I've looked into cleaning them up before, but I didn't want to modify the dependency arrays and put in a lot of stuff because a lot of them were written with the intention to only run on that
Absolutely.
single condition, right? So it's like they're inherently broken now, and the the warnings, I don't know if they'll ever go away, right?
Right. I mean, this is a thing that's come up. I have written a hook called use conditional effect, which does what people are using use effect for, like what you talked about. You could drop that in and it would work correctly without having to, we could blanket replace every use effect with use conditional effect and everything would work correctly, and we would be using the API right. But really my point here is more like I really think releasing use effect as they did from React was a mistake. Now at the time, maybe they did not anticipate how people were going to use it, and so I'm not like faulting them for releasing it how they did, but it's definitely not the right API. I think it's been demonstrated that we can do better, and so I get the actual underlying reasoning. So React said when they released it that they said we don't expect people to use effect very much. We expect people to build other hooks that use effect. That so you'd have like use conditional effect, or use on load effect or whatever if you only wanted it to run. Like their intention seemed to be you only use it as like an underlying primitive. It's not something that necessarily gets exposed to user code. Now, that in some ways has happened. There's been a lot of hooks that do use it underneath, but my experience, like you were saying, has been that dream of React didn't really happen. Most people are just using use effect just plainly as it comes, and you know, I don't know that placing blame really matters, but I think like going forward, facilities like that need to change. They need to be made safe by default, easy to use by default, correct by default.
Well, I think the problem is a lot of these new hook features are really easy to use and
Yes.
like way too easy to use.
Yes.
And like I can tell you personally that I haven't read the using the effect hook page on the React docs line by line all the way through to fully understand it, because as I do work, it's required of me to work fast and build out features, and it's like I haven't made the time to fully understand what I'm even using.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
so
if you don't mind me cutting in, I will say that that's I don't in this some cases I would be like, RTFM, but in this case, I don't think that's the case because there's a lot of disagreement on the interpretation of those documentation, and the documentation is sort of spread out if you want to get the whole idea of how it works, and I think it's a messy situation. And this is a case where the way it's being used in the real world right now is actually probably the most relevant use and the most important thing to actually understand. What the theoretical docs are saying to do and how to use it and about it doesn't really matter as much, in my opinion. So, like, I really don't know if I would feel too bad about not knowing the docs in this case.
well, it's like I think that the what I was more getting at is like they made these things so easy to use, and you're like, hey, I'm now using these
Oh,
functional
yeah.
components. I need to
Yep.
do component did update or component will mount. And then you just like quickly read the manual for that, and then you don't go into all the caveats for the rest of the hooks, right? And so like not I feel like that's honestly how most people
Yes,
using this
absolutely.
tool do it, is like on an as needed basis.
Yeah.
And so, but I mean,
Well, I,
in a way,
uh,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say I don't. Again, I blame the underlying system for that. Like, it should be usable like you're describing. I think this there are some systems when you're programming you do need to like really understand how it works, but I think a thing like this that you're using all the time in your front end code, there's no need for you to have to read through and understand this thick manual. It should definitely be as needed basis, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, the whole thing is I think a lot of this is has been released as where they're just trying to create something to create an easier development environment for us to use React in. I think they knew that it would be kind of exploratory, like, hey, here's how it's intended to use. We hope you do it right. And I mean, when have we ever, like, for example, guns? Guns were created initially to, like, to hunt, right? Weapons were like for hunting, and then weapons, like, eventually people realized they could kill each other with them, and it's like, oh well, that's not what we really intended to do with these
Mm.
things. And like now that use effect is already out in the ecosystem and it's being used like very heavily in perhaps incorrect ways. Now the React team like to do these to like make things work like the way they intended them, they now have to deal with the unintentional use in
Mm,
their
yep.
like their attempts to create new versions that are backward compatible. So it's like I feel pretty bad for like that situation. Like
Yeah.
it's like, oh man, these idiots like did it all wrong, and now we have to make sure that our next release doesn't break 90% of the applications in existence because like they took this tool we made and they're using it like in all these crazy ways.
Yeah, I agree. I'm putting on my 20 years into the future eyes and saying like, yeah, that's enough time for them to figure out how to get around that situation. But you're absolutely right. That's the situation we're in now, and yeah, it's got to be dealt with.
Well, I'm sure that they'll figure it out. Like
Yeah.
the um, the next topic you wanted to go into, I believe, is concurrency. They're already working on that in the new releases. What are your thoughts on the future of that?
So this is a really interesting one. In the 3L project, I don't know if I solved it, and I don't know if anyone's really fully solved it yet. But my imagination around concurrency is that I don't even know if we can do it anymore with something like JavaScript and React. I'm not sure. Maybe we can. But like my general idea around it is that we should have automatic concurrency. So you just write a program and you don't really have to think about concurrency at all. And the computer should be able to convert that into units of computation that can be spread across all the cores on the system that make sense. Maybe, and also makes sense in terms of which cores to run it on, the big cores, the little cores, all cores, just one core. So when developing the 3L project, I was working on coming up with sort of a different way of programming, a different type of purely functional program that would allow the underlying operating system to do that. So you didn't really have to think about threading or concurrency. All you do is just write your code and it just magically makes it happen. So maybe we can't go all that way with JavaScript or React. Maybe it's literally not possible because of the way the language is designed or whatever. But I think in the spirit of the upcoming React release, like moving towards doing more things automatically. And the other thing I would like is some way to maybe, like, if we can't get it all automatic, some way to do it manually or tell the system that I want to do it manually. And we do have service workers and things like that, but I find it to be kind of clunky and indirect. I would look for a much more seamless system.
How do you think that is possible considering how JavaScript runs on like how
It would
JavaScript
have to
works?
change. Yeah. I mean, this is our super looking into the future. Like if we could have anything, yes, the current, that's what I was saying at the beginning. I'm not necessarily looking at the current trajectory of anything. I'm saying like ignore that and just jump to the future. What
Okay,
could we
okay.
have, like, because I want to make computing really better, not like just incrementally better. Like when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking like, yeah, if we really applied our resources, we could probably make all these changes happen. It would take time, but we could probably do it if we put enough money and time into it, right? And so that's where I'm
Right.
like, okay, yeah, right now that sounds really difficult given the current way JavaScript is run and how we've got 20 years of code working based on that model. And maybe we need to introduce a new model, maybe we need to introduce new primitives, like so many different things we could do. But I think it could be done. And so what I'm like looking at is what type of model would we like to program in? And I would love to program in one where I don't have to worry about the underlying hardware so much. I can just write my code and it will just optimally run it.
I got you. Yeah, I'm having a hard time thinking so much out the box as you are, and you're making me feel brave holding my hand to take me out of the box. So, but that's I think this is a universal human problem is humanity, it's like this train that is going, and all of the problems stem from the fact that the train is running, and there's there's some need to keep the train going, like there it's like we have to keep going, like we can't
Mm,
stop, but all of the problems that our entire species um, is running into could be resolved if we just stop the train for a couple of days, you know,
hmm.
and like said, hey, how do we reevaluate this? And that's exactly what's happening, like you're saying, with the software, our environment that we're in. It's like for some reason, like we just like can't stop and won't stop. So it's like
Yes,
I
absolutely.
think the it's like how do we figure out a way to create like a separate platform from that train that we can like have a space that is not rushed to actually innovate, without like the insane can't stop won't stop mentality.
Yeah.
I don't know how we'll get there. Like as a species,
Yeah.
it's a very big problem.
I I have theories on it being tied into larger systems, but that might be a subject for a different show. um,
Yeah, the conspiracy theory show.
I don't know about that, but I would say it was a perfect tie-in to the next topic and the last topic I want to talk about, which was ecological impact. And I think this is what you don't really ever see on like a feature list, hardly. But I think it's something we should be thinking about more, because computers are going to be used more and more. Absolutely, we already know that, right? They're going to be everywhere eventually if our current trajectory continues. If let's just assume that happens. Um, I think as programmers, we have a responsibility to think about the impact of that on the ecology that we live in that supports us. And so part of the 3L project and part of what I want to talk about here is like, are there things we could do on a large scale, systemic scale to reduce our ecological impact of the programs we write? I know this is probably a different topic than most people would hear brought up, but I thought it could be interesting and also useful.
No, it makes me think about being in school. Like when you're in school, or at least this was my experience, you have like five classes, and each class gives you a certain amount of homework, and they don't take into account, each class doesn't take into account that you also have other classes giving you the same amount or even more homework, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this is happening with computing, is like I'm running Safari, I'm running this Jitsi right now to do this chat. I have Google Drive open. I closed down Slack because if I had Slack open right now, good lord, like I don't know if my computer would even run that piece
Yeah.
of crap. Sorry, Slack, it's the reality. Um, and like every service that is being created seems to be like created without any concept that other services are also running in the ecosystem.
Yeah,
And
brilliant
it's
point.
insane to think like how much computing processing is happening just to do like these really mundane and
Mm-hmm.
maybe even meaningless things. And the amount of server farms that Amazon is like opening up in my state. I know that like they just put in a huge server farm up the road in Ashland, Virginia from us, and it's like what, like yeah, the like what is running on that, like how we program like affecting the heat output, the electrical output, the energy resources going into that farm. It's a really important question that is back to that train. It's
Yeah.
like, do
Yep.
we don't even think about it.
Well, and yeah, like how many times have you had a client or an employer, or a PM or something say to you, all right, this next sprint is focused on reducing our ecological impact of the program that will be running on 5 million devices or whatever. That doesn't happen.
No, it's not even a thought. It doesn't even cross people's minds.
Right.
I worked at a cruise ship company, which I won't name because this could it could be some backlash from this. But I went on the cruise and it was like 9 p.m. and then we were all drunk and we were like, oh, dude, the buffets are closing. Like, this, hurry up. And so we ran and like got to the buffet, and there were a bunch of workers strolling around with these like huge shopping cart Tupperwares. And like, I'll never forget, this dude has a huge tray of uneaten chicken wings, and he just like tips the tray, and they just like, I hear them plunking into this soup of all the rest of the stuff that wasn't eaten from the buffet. And I was just like, what are y'all doing? And
Mm.
they were like, oh, well, the all this uneaten food is sent below deck to be incinerated. And just, I was like, wait, what? Like, and the amount of, like, I did some studies, and ran some numbers, and there's like, with all the amount of cruise ships in the world, like thousands of tons of food waste is being produced on these cruise ships every week, due to them not properly calculating the amount of food that they need. So I like came up with a tracking system where we could easily do that, and nothing happened. About 2 weeks, no, like 2 months later, I heard from the guy who had introduced the thing to, and he was like, "Hey, like, check out this slideshow," and it was like 2024 goals, like look at like environmental impact, and like sustainability impact of how
Mm-hmm.
we how we operate. And I was like, dude, I literally created this like tracking system that would have taken a week to prototype, implement on board, and the world could have started changing. And I know for a fact they still haven't done anything about it. And it's like, back to the train. It's like, when will we realize that we're building, like, we built the rails far off a cliff at this point, and it's like, how's the train like even still like in the air like right
Yeah.
now? So
Yeah, that was a really, I think, instructive story about what we're talking about. And I think you're totally right. Like, um, incentives in our society are not towards, looking at the ecological impact. That's just not, nobody's incentivized to that. It's only ever a corporate slide to make them look good in marketing. I mean, there's probably some, company somewhere that's, has their employees pick up trash along the side of the highway. But like, are we doing things like large changes, large things like in terms of like what we're talking about here, our ecological impact for programs? No, that's not a thing. Maybe you have a nonprofit that does it, but like the vast majority, it's not a thing anyone's thinking about. It's not the focus. It's not what they get compensated for. That's not where we are. So yeah, I think we could take this time to call
well,
out.
I mean, it comes down
Oh, go
to
on.
meta thinking.
Yeah.
Well, it like it comes down to like all the things that we've been asking for. It's like, can we get like a better debugging environment to figure out why these re-renders are, like,
Mm-hmm.
imagine the environmental footprint of all of these unnecessary re-renders in React applications.
Yeah.
Like, it sounds silly to like consider, but it, like, when millions of people are visiting a React app, and there are hundreds of thousands of React apps perhaps re-rendering improperly. You don't even think about it, but it could be like having a
Yeah.
huge like impact that we just aren't even aware of.
Yeah.
And I think that's the scary thing is like we just don't even know how like bad it is because no one's taken the time to think about it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what I was about to say is like, this is, I think, a time to call out, Facebook, the creators of React. They have the resources to work on this. There's absolutely no doubt if they wanted to, they could. And I think they should. Like, they should look at React and say, okay, are there things we can do to reduce its ecological impact, like providing better tools for figuring out the performance related things like re-renders and profilers, or built in things like not running code when the application's not visible on the user's screen, or letting users specify, okay, this is critical code that we want to run in the background and the rest doesn't need to. Like, I think that is really on them as people with the resources that created it that could do it. And of course it's on us as implementers as well to take that into consideration. But usually we're not the ones, high enough on the food chain to make decisions on allocating resources to that thing. Whereas if React made those improvements, it would just blanket apply to everyone that's using it, which would be a massive, massive improvement, I think, in terms of ecological impact for society.
Man, I think I found a social cause I can actually get behind. I never even considered the impact of how I write my code having an effect on the environment, and
Yeah.
it's pretty wild to consider that. And
Uh, it's actually really it sounds like a weird plug for Owl Creek because we focus on performance, but like that's not how I intend it. I really just want to say like performance, I'll often say don't worry about it up front, but I do worry about it after I write the code. And even if I'm not hitting a performance bottleneck, sometimes what I'll do is just profile my code and eliminate the largest bottlenecks, because that usually means improvement in performance and less ecological impact. I mean, that is actually a simple way any of us could do it now, is make our code perform better. I mean, it's just that would work. It's not as good as like a systemic thing, coming through from React to make it all better, or browser engines or whatever. But like, it is something we can do now.
I mean, it's pretty much the subconscious reason why we called our consultancy Owl Creek, because we were thinking about that creek, that hunting ground for that owl, and how React applications are so underperformant. And our mission is to save the Owl Creeks of the world through writing more performant React applications. Pretty much, that's the subconscious drive, I guess, behind it all, right?
Absolutely, I love it. Totally. Yes,
That is
Owl
great.
Creek.
I found a new inspiration for doing my day to day now. Thank you.
Yeah, anytime. um, yeah, I think this has been way more fun than I imagined, but unfortunately, we gotta start winding this down. We had one Q&A question.
Yeah,
Um,
this is the longest podcast to date, I think. We're
oh
definitely
yeah,
over an hour.
yeah, it's showing me 59 minutes right now. So
Wow, nice.
yeah, so the question we had, which was from Marissa in Budapest. In episode 3, when we were talking about high quality at high speed, writing high quality code quickly, I talked a lot about contracts and how I view code as a contract, and each line as a contract sometimes. And I asked Austin what he thought about contracts, and we never got an answer. So, Austin, Marissa would like to know, what is your opinion about contracts?
Hey, Thomas, I'm losing you again. My connection's cutting out. No, I'm kidding. Um,
Austin
I
doesn't want to tell
actually
us. Things about contracts.
Well, until this episode, when we talked about the show notes before, you asked me, you're like, "Hey, I'm gonna ask you about that," and I was just like, I have no clue how I'm even gonna answer that. But now that we talked about this ecological impact, just like thinking about the way I write my code has taken on a completely different meaning just in the last 10 to 30 minutes in a way that I hadn't thought about before. And so I feel like maybe it's not the answer that's expected, but like thinking about like the purpose behind what I am doing, and it's like right now a company that we're working on, we pride ourselves in developing quickly and developing fast. At what expense? And well, it's the expense of our planet, perhaps, because I know that the people using the application we're building is reaching huge numbers, right? And it's like the way that I'm implementing each feature or writing each line of code now has like a completely new meaning. Um, like one of the where we're talking about updating to React Query across our application right now, and I had kind of avoided it a little bit recently, and I started this week to rewrite an API endpoint, a call to an API endpoint, because the way that we like load, we list the next items on a table. When we scroll to the bottom, sometimes the scroll will like bounce at the bottom and initiate like 10 server calls, and then once the movement stops, it like all of those are pinging the server, and it's like creating a huge stress on the server potentially. And React Query by default is one of the ways that we're like getting rid of that. It queries the server more intelligently. It's
Yeah.
not solving the problem directly for
It
sure. It's like an
caches
indirect solution.
it caches it. So we're not retrieving the data 5,000 times every 5 seconds and we don't need to.
Right. So it's like I now have like a newfound motivation to do that work after we get off this call. And so yeah, like I guess my answer is like I don't know if I had taken like what I do and the cleanliness of how I write code or the performance of it at this current job super seriously, because it's like, hey, get this feature over the line and we'll refactor it later. Now I feel much more obligated to, instead of saying, hey, like at Owl Creek, that's when like we go in and solve bottlenecks as our profession. But like when I'm doing contract work, even if I'm being told to write things quickly, I feel like I have some sort of standard now that I have to hold myself to a contract with each line that I write. So pretty deep stuff, man. I appreciate this podcast took a completely different turn than I expected. So
Yeah, that was a great response, and it's not what I expected, but I think it was great. So thank you, Austin. I think we're gonna start closing things down here. I'll just mention again, if you wanted to check out the Foundations of High Performance React book, and if you wanted to learn how React works under the covers and get a better understanding of how to write more performant code, more efficient code, yeah, you can check it out at owlcreek.studio. We got a link for the book there. And yeah, also if you have any feedback or questions, or especially on this episode, if you know about tools or things that we talked about that would address some of the things we brought up, that would be awesome to learn about. If you have any more questions, if you want to hear more about any of these topics, we'd love to hear from you at the React Show at owlcreek.studio. And yeah, that's it. That's our show. It's been great. It's been fun talking with you, Austin. And yeah, I look forward to doing this again. See y'all later.
Thank you. Thanks for coming by. Take care, y'all.